The man on the bridge was not a giant. Not really. He was maybe 6 feet tall, broad in the shoulder, with a tangled red beard. But to the English soldiers below, on the banks of the River Derwent, he seemed immense. It was September 25th, 1066. The battle, which would later be called Stamford Bridge, had been raging for hours. The English army, led by King Harold Godwinson, had surprised the Norwegian invaders under King Harold Hardrada. The English had numbers, they had the advantage, but they could not cross the narrow wooden bridge. This one man was the reason. He stood alone. He held a great double-handed axe. The planks of the bridge around his feet were dark and slick with the blood of his enemies. At least 40 English soldiers had tried to cross. None had succeeded. He fought with a fury that was not human. He did not seem to feel pain. He did not seem to feel fear. He roared, a low guttural sound that carried over the clash of steel and the screams of men. The English soldiers, exhausted and afraid, hesitated. They had a word for men like him, a word they had learned from the Northmen themselves. They called him a berserker. The word came from the Old Norse language, berserker. It meant bare shirt or bare skin. Some of these champions wore the pelts of bears into battle. They believed it gave them the strength and ferocity of the animal. They worked themselves into a trance-like rage before a fight. They bit their shields, they howled, they were the shock troops of the Viking world, a terrifying weapon meant to break an enemy's spirit before breaking their lines. And this man on the bridge, he was the living embodiment of that word. He was berserk. King Harold Godwinson grew impatient. The day was wasting. He needed to get his army across the river to finish the fight. He could not afford a long delay. He had heard rumors that another invader, William of Normandy, was preparing to cross the Channel from the south. This battle in the north was a problem he needed to solve quickly, but the man on the bridge would not fall. He stood his ground, a lone warrior against an entire army, his axe rising and falling in a relentless, deadly rhythm. Finally, an English soldier had an idea. It was not a heroic idea, it was not a noble one, but it was practical. He found an empty barrel, a swill tub, and pushed it into the river. He climbed in using a small spear to paddle himself under the bridge. He was hidden from the berserker's view. He floated directly beneath the spot where the Norsemen stood. The sounds of the battle were muffled from down there, the berserker's roars echoing through the timbers. The soldier looked up. He could see the gaps between the wooden planks. He waited for his moment, then he thrust his long spear upward with all his strength. The spearhead punched through the wood and into the berserker from below. The man on the bridge gave a single sharp cry of shock and pain. His axe wavered. He staggered, looking down in disbelief. The English soldiers on the bank saw their chance. They surged forward, a wave of shields and swords. The berserker fell. The way was clear. The English army poured across the bridge. The battle was won. But the story of the lone warrior, the man who went berserk, would be told for centuries. His legend and his name became a permanent part of the English language. Number 21. You can't tell a story about a group of people without them. The year was 952. Brother Aldred sat hunched over a sheet of vellum in the scriptorium at Lindisfarne. The monastery had been rebuilt since the first great raid over 170 years before, but the world outside its stone walls had changed. This part of Northumbria was now deep within the Danelaw. Norse settlers were everywhere. Their language was everywhere. Aldred was not writing a grand gospel. He was writing a simple charter, a record of a land agreement between two families. One was English, the family of Eadwulf. The other was Norse, the family of a farmer named Ketil. The problem was the pronouns. It was a simple problem, but it was maddening. Aldred dipped his quill in the inkpot, a mix of oak galls and iron salts. He was trying to describe what both families agreed to. In his own language, Old English, the third-person plural pronouns were hi, hira, and him. But High looked and sounded almost exactly like the masculine singular pronoun he, which meant he. And it also sounded a lot like the feminine singular hio, which meant she. When he wrote it down, the sentence was confusing. And he agreed to the boundary, and High would respect it. Who was who? Was it Eadwulf? Was it Ketil's family? Was it both families? He could hear the people talking outside in the market. He heard the rough guttural sounds of Old Norse mixing with the softer tones of his own Northumbrian dialect. He heard Ketil's wife, Sigrid, haggling with a fisherman. She pointed to a group of men mending their nets. She said a word he heard all the time from the settlers. There, they. A little later, she was talking about a debt owed to her family. She used another word. Thera, there. When talking to them directly, it was Theum, them. Aldred stopped writing. He listened, theum, thera. The words were so clear, there was no confusion. The sound, written with the letter Thorn Thea, was sharp and distinct. It could not be mistaken for he or she. It was simple, it was efficient, it was just better. The Norse speakers used it for groups of men, groups of women, and mixed groups. It solved his problem instantly. He looked back at his vellum. He scratched out the confusing Old English high. He hesitated for a moment. He was a man of tradition, a preserver of his language and culture. To use a foreign word felt like a small betrayal. But the purpose of the charter was clarity. Its function was to prevent future disputes. Ambiguity was the enemy. He took a breath and wrote the Norse word instead. It looked strange on the page, a little piece of the Viking world embedded in his English script, but it was clear. And Eadwulf agreed to the boundary, and there would respect it. Everyone who read it would know that they meant both families together. Aldred did not know it, but he was not alone. All across the north and east of England, in towns and villages where English and Norse people lived side by side, the same quiet revolution was happening. People were talking, they were trading, they were arguing, they were marrying, and they were choosing the words that worked best. The clear, simple Norse pronouns started to push out the older, more confusing English ones. It took a few hundred years, but eventually the children of Ketil and Eadwulf would speak a new kind of English, and when they wanted to talk about a group of people, they would use the words they, them, and their. They would have no idea that these essential words were a gift from the Vikings who had settled on their shores. Number 20. A house needs to breathe, but it doesn't need a door in the middle of the wall. And Leif stood back and looked at the new longhouse. It was the year 890. He had finished the main structure just before the first heavy rains of autumn. He had built it in the Norse style with, curved walls like the hull of a ship turned upside down. The frame was solid oak, cut from the woods a few miles west of their small settlement near the River Trent. The walls were wattle and daub, a mixture of woven hazel branches and clay mixed with dung and straw. The roof was thick turf. It was a good house, strong enough to last for generations. He had built it for his wife, Edith, and their 2 young sons. Edith was English. Her village was a day's walk to the south. Their marriage had been an arrangement to secure peace between his people and hers. But they had grown to love each other. She was a good wife, she worked hard, but she did not understand some of his ways. Today was one of those days. Leif picked up his axe. He walked to the long south-facing wall, the one that would get the most sun. He chose a spot about head height, between 2 of the main vertical timbers, and he started to cut a hole. It was not a big hole, maybe the size of a man's head, but to Edith, who came out of the old temporary hut to see what he was doing, it was an act of madness. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. "You'll let the winter in, you'll let the spirits in." Her people's houses were dark. The only openings were the low doorway and a smoke hole in the center of the roof. Its windows were an alien concept. A hole in the wall was a weakness. It was an invitation to cold, to rain, to bad luck. Leif stopped chopping. He turned to her and smiled. "It's a Vindaga," he said, in his own language. He pointed to the sky. "Vinder, wind." He pointed to his own eye. "Aga, eye. A wind eye. An eye for the wind." She did not understand the word. He tried to explain in her tongue, a clumsy mix of his Norse and her English. "For light," he said, pointing at the sun. "For smoke," he said, pointing to the hearth inside the dark house where A fire would soon be lit. The smoke goes up, but some stays. It makes the eyes water. This lets the bad air out. She was not convinced. She shook her head. "It is a hole," she said simply. "A hole in our house. Leaf finished cutting the opening." He smoothed the edges with his knife. A small square patch of bright autumn sky appeared in the dark wall. A sliver of light fell onto the dirt floor inside. He showed her how he had also made a small shutter of wood, held in place with a leather strap. At night, or in a storm, they could close the wind eye. It would be secure. That first winter was hard. The winds howled across the flatlands, the rain was relentless, but the house was warm, a fire burned constantly in the central hearth. And the little Vindaga did its job. It let out the worst of the smoke, making the inside of the longhouse more breathable, less stinging on the eyes. And on the rare clear days, it let in a precious beam of low winter sun. The boys, Bjorn and Alcuin, would chase the patch of light on the floor. Slowly, Edith came to accept the hole in the wall. Her English neighbors who came to visit were suspicious at first, but they saw that Leif's house was less smoky than theirs. They saw the little bit of extra light. The word Vindoga was strange to their ears, but it made sense. Wind eye. Over the next years, as more Norse and English families lived together, the idea and the word began to spread. The English tongue shortened the strange Norse word. Vindauga became Windowa, and then, much later, just window. It was a simple practical idea from the north, a small opening that let a little bit of the outside world in. Number 19. A man's most important job is to be bound to his house. Astrid was 17. The year was 927. She was standing beside her father Olaf in the bustling market of Jorvik, the great Viking city that the English called York. Today was her wedding day. She was to be married to a man named Wulfstan. He was not one of her people. He was an Anglo-Saxon merchant, a man whose family had lived in this city for generations before the Northmen came. Wulfstan was wealthy. He was said to be a good man. The marriage was a good match, a bridge between the old world of the English and the new power of the Norse. And Olaf was giving her some final advice. He was not a man for soft words. He was a warrior and a trader who had sailed to Iceland and beyond. He spoke plainly. "Wulfstan will be your lord," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You will be the lady of his hall. You will manage the household, the servants, the food, the weaving. That is your work. It is important work." Astrid nodded. She knew her duties. She had been trained for them her whole life. "But you must understand what he is," Olaf continued, his voice dropping a little. "In our tongue, we would call him a husbandi." He stressed the word, hus, house, bondi, dweller, or one who is bound. He is the housebound one. His life is tied to that house, to that land. He is responsible for its prosperity and its safety. He is not just a man, a ver. He is not just a fighter, a drengur. He is the husbandi. His strength is not just in his sword arm, but in his storerooms. His honor is not just in battle, but in the good reputation of his home. Astrid thought about this. The English had a word for a man like Wulfstan. They called him a ceorl if he was a freeman, or a theng if he was of a higher rank. But the Norse word felt different. It was more specific. It defined a man by his responsibilities to his home and family. The house was the center of his world. He was bound to it. "Wulfstan is a good merchant," Olaf said. "He knows how to make money. This is a good skill for a husbandi. He will fill your storerooms. He will keep you safe. Your job is to turn his wealth into a strong, respected household. Together, you make the house strong. That is the way." Later that day, she stood with Wulfstan in his large timber-framed house near the river Ouse. He was a kind-faced man, older than her by 10 years. He showed her the house, the storerooms filled with grain and salted fish, the weaving looms, the sleeping quarters. He spoke of his trade, of the wool and pottery he sent down the river to be sold. As he spoke, Astrid saw him not just as Wulfstan, the Anglo-Saxon merchant. She saw him as her father had described. He was the husbandi. This house, this land, this family, it was his charge. He was bound to it. And now, so was she. The Norse word gave her a new way to understand her new life and, the man she had married. The word itself, husbandi, began to take root in the English soil of the Danelaw. The English people heard it and understood its meaning. It was a useful word. It described a specific role, the master of a household, the man with responsibility. Over time, the sounds shifted. The sharp vowels softened. Husbandi slowly transformed into the English word husband. It lost its direct connection to the word house, but it kept its core meaning, a man bound by duty to his family. Number 18, you can't build a society on violence. You need rules that are laid down. The dispute was over 3 strips of land. It was a common problem in the year 904. The land near the settlement of Torksey in Lincolnshire was fertile, and every family wanted as much as they could get. And Eric, a Norse settler, claimed that his neighbor, an Englishman named Ordgar, had moved the wooden posts that marked their boundary in the middle of the night. Ordgar claimed Eric's cattle had trampled his young crops, and the debt of that damage was worth the land. A generation earlier, this disagreement would have been settled with axes, blood would have been shed. A feud would have started that could have lasted for years, but things were different now. They did not reach for their axes. Instead, they went to the Thing. The Thing was an assembly held on a low hill a mile outside the settlement. It was held every few weeks. All the free men of the area, both Norse and English, came to witness justice, make new agreements, and settle disputes. It was their government and their courthouse, all held in the open air. Eric and Ordgar stood before the law speaker. The law speaker was an old man named Halfdan. He was not a king or a lord. He was a farmer, respected for his knowledge. His job was not to make the rules, but to remember them. He had to know the lag. Lag was the Old Norse word for law. But it didn't mean a rule written in a book by a king. Its original meaning was something laid down, like laying down oars in a boat in a set order, or laying down stones for a foundation. It was the established, agreed upon order of things, the custom of the community laid down and remembered. Halfdan listened to Eric's complaint, then he listened to Ordgar's defense. Other men from the community came forward as witnesses. One man had seen Ordgar near the boundary posts late at night. Another had seen Eric's cattle in Ordgar's field. There was shouting. Accusations flew, but Halfdan kept order. When everyone had spoken, Halfdan stood up on a large flat stone so all could see him. He did not give his own opinion. He recited the lag. He spoke of the law for moving a boundary marker, a serious crime. The penalty was a heavy fine of silver. Then he recited the law for damage done by stray cattle. The penalty for that was also a fine to be paid in grain. The assembly muttered. The 2 laws applied. Both men were partly at fault. Halfdan then proposed a judgment based on the lag. Ordgar would pay the fine for moving the marker. Eric would pay the fine for the damage from his cattle. The original boundary would be restored, with new markers set in place and witnessed by 10 men. Eric and Ordgar were not happy. Neither had won a clear victory, but they accepted the judgment. The community accepted the judgment. It was the lag. It was the way things were done. It was better than a blood feud. It was a way for 2 different peoples, Norse and English, to live together without constant violence. Ordgar, the Englishman, walked home that day thinking about the Norse word, lag. His own people had words for rules and doom judgment, but this concept of a collective, spoken, remembered set of rules was powerful. It was something solid you could depend on. It was something that was laid down. The word and the system of public justice it represented was influential. It spread through the Danelaw. The English people adopted it. They began to talk about the lagu. Hundreds of years later, that simple, practical Norse word for the rules laid down by a community would become one of the most important words in the English language law. Number 17. Some things are just crooked and there is no way to make them straight. Ivar, the shipbuilder, ran his hand along the great piece of oak. It was long, almost 40 feet, and thick. It was meant to be the keel for a new trading gnar. He was building. He had paid a good price for it. 3 silver pennies to a farmer who had felled it a year ago and let it season. From the outside, it had looked perfect, straight and true. But now that he and his son had started to shape it with their adzees, they had found a problem. The grain of the wood did not run straight. Halfway down its length, it had a subtle, dangerous twist. It was not something you could see easily. You had to feel it. You had to understand the way the wood grew. And Ivar had been building boats in this fjord near Kaupang since he was a boy for over 30 years. It was the year 855, where he knew wood, and this piece of wood was Rangr. Rangr was the Old Norse word for something that was twisted, crooked, or wrong. It was a physical description. A rope could be Rangr if it was frayed. A mast could be Rangr if it was warped. And a keel, the very backbone of a ship, could not be Rangr. A ship built on a crooked keel would never sail true. It would constantly try to turn on itself. In a storm, that weakness could be fatal. The whole ship could break apart. His son, Finn, who was only 16, did not see the problem. "Father, we can force it straight," he said. "We can use braces. Once the ribs are attached, it will hold its shape." Ivar shook his head. He spat on the ground. "No, the wood has its own will. This piece grew with a twist. The twist is in its heart. You can force it for a while, but it will always want to go back to its shape. It will always be fighting you. The stress will be there hidden until the one day you cannot afford it. This wood is Rangr. It is useless to us." He marked the timber with a piece of charcoal. It would be cut up for firewood or maybe used for small, non-structural parts of the boat. But its destiny as a keel was over. It was a costly setback. It would take weeks to find another piece of oak that long and that straight. But Ivar would not compromise. A shipbuilder's reputation rested on his boats. If one of his ships failed at sea, his name would be worthless. Finn looked at the rejected timber. He was learning. He was learning that some flaws could not be fixed. Some things were just fundamentally crooked. The word Rangr was not just about wood. It was a word you could use for a bad deal, a dishonest man, a journey that went badly. It described something that had deviated from the straight, true path. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ivar told Finn a story about a man who had made a bad promise. "His oath was Rangr," Ivar said. "It was twisted from the start, and it brought him nothing but trouble." The idea was simple and powerful. Straight is good, crooked is bad. As Norse sailors and traders traveled, they took their words with them. In the harbors of England, they would describe a bad anchor rope or a poor bargain as Rangr. The English people who traded with them heard the word. It was a good word, direct and easy to understand. It fit into their language easily. The ah sound changed to an o. The harder at the end fell away, and Rangr, the shipbuilder's word for a piece of wood that was twisted and useless, became the English word wrong. Number 16. The name of a weapon often comes from the name of a woman. The year was 1346. Thomas was a master mason, but here at the Tower of London, his skills were being used for war. He was part of a team building a new kind of weapon. It wasn't a catapult or a trebuchet that flung rocks using a counterweight. This was something new, a fearsome machine of forged iron bands bound together to form a tube. It used black powder, a dusty mix of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, to hurl heavy stones with a deafening roar. They didn't have a proper name for it yet. They called them fire pots or iron cannons. But this latest one was the biggest yet. It was over 6 feet long and could throw a stone ball weighing nearly 50 pounds. The man in charge of the Royal Armory, a knight named Sir Robert, wanted a proper name for it. A name to inspire fear. One evening, Thomas was sharing a meal with one of the guards, a man named Rolf. Rolf was from the North Country, from, a family that still told the old stories, the sagas of their Norse ancestors. Sir Robert had been talking that day about naming the great weapon Mars or Werwolf. Rolf scoffed at the names. "They are not right," Rolf said, chewing on a piece of hard bread. "A great weapon should have a woman's name, a strong woman." Thomas was confused. Why a woman's name? In the old stories, Rolf explained, the most fearsome things are often female, Valkyries who choose the slain, shield maidens, and the names themselves hold power. Take the name Gunhildr. It is a common name in my family. It comes from two Old Norse words, Gunnr, which means war or battle, and Hildr, which also means battle. Her name is Battle, a woman named for war itself. And Thomas thought about this. Gunhildr, war battle. He liked the sound of it. It had a hard, brutal ring to it. The next day, when Sir Robert was inspecting the new weapon, Thomas, feeling bold, made the suggestion. Sire, perhaps we could name her Gunhilda. He used the Latinized form of the name. Sir Robert considered it. Gunhilda, he repeated. He knew the name. It was the name of several famous Danish and Norwegian queens from the Viking Age, women known for their fierce and cunning nature. It was a name with a history of power. He liked it. The great iron cannon was officially christened Gunhilda. The name was painted on its wooden carriage. The men who operated it, however, were not formal. They were soldiers and craftsmen. They shortened the name. Time to load Gunhilda became time to load Gunny, and soon any large cannon or similar weapon was simply called a gun. The word had a strange journey. It did not come directly from a Viking word for a weapon. It came from a Viking woman's name, Gunhildr, a name that meant war. That name was given to a single large medieval cannon in England, and from that one cannon the name was passed on to all the firearms that followed. It is an odd twist of history that one of the most common words for a weapon in the English language started as the name of a Scandinavian woman, a name that echoed the warlike spirit of her ancestors. Number 15. Some gifts are not given freely, they come with a heavy obligation. The chieftain, Jarl Einar, held up the armband. It was made of twisted gold, heavy and gleaming in the firelight of the longhouse. It was the year 869. His warband had just returned to their base in East Anglia after a successful raid. They were celebrating, the hall was filled with the smell of roasted meat and spilled ale. He called forward a young warrior named Ulf. Ulf had fought bravely in the raid. He had been the first man over the wall of the monastery they had attacked. He had protected Einar when the chieftain was unhorsed. Now he was being rewarded. Einar spoke, his voice booming through the hall. Ulf, for your courage, I give you this. He slid the gold band onto Ulf's arm. This is my gift to you. Gipt was the Old Norse word for gift, but it meant much more than a simple present. In the Viking world, a gift was a transaction. It was a tool for building loyalty. When a Jarl gave a gift to one of his warriors, it was not an act of pure generosity. It was a down payment. It was a binding contract sealed not with wax and parchment, but with gold and public honor. Ulf felt the weight of the gold on his arm. It was more wealth than he had ever possessed, but he also felt the weight of the obligation. By accepting the gift, he was renewing his oath of loyalty to Jarl Einar. He was bound to fight for him, to die for him, if necessary. The gold was a visible sign of this bond. Every time he looked at it, he would be reminded of his duty. To refuse the gift would have been a grave insult. To accept it was to accept the responsibility that came with it. The other warriors in the hall cheered. They banged their drinking horns on the long tables. They were not just celebrating Ulf's reward. They were witnessing the reinforcement of their social structure. The Jarl's power depended on his ability to give gifts. The warriors' loyalty was secured by their acceptance of those gifts. This cycle of giving and obligation was the glue that held their society together. An English thrall, a servant named Surdik, who had been captured in a previous raid, watched from the shadows. He understood the ceremony. He had seen it before. His own people had a similar tradition of lords giving gifts to their thanes, but the Norse word gipt was used constantly. It was part of their everyday speech. Years later, Surdik escaped and made his way back to an English village. The area was now part of the Danelaw, and Norse settlers were beginning to farm the land alongside the English. Surdik heard the word gipt. Used in a different context, a Norse farmer might talk about the gift of a good harvest from the gods. A woman might speak of the gift of a healthy child. The meaning was expanding. It still implied something valuable that was given, but the sense of direct, personal obligation was fading in these new contexts. The English people started to adopt the word. It was short and useful. The harp sound in the middle softened over time, influenced by the Old English word gift, which meant payment for a wife. The two words merged, and the Norse pronunciation and core meaning of something given came to dominate. The word gift became the common term, shedding the complex web of Viking Age obligation and retaining only the simple positive idea of a present given freely. But deep in its history, the word carries the echo of a gold armband given in a smoky longhouse, a treasure that was also a chain. So number 14, to die is not a gentle fading away, it is a sudden stop. The old woman Elswith lay on a straw pallet in the corner of her family's small hut. She was dying. It was the winter of 940 in a small village in what was once the kingdom of Mercia. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Her breathing was shallow. Her family gathered around her. They knew the end was near. Her son Leofwine held her hand. In his language, Old English, people who were dying were storfen or swelten. These words carried a sense of a slow process, of starving or fading away. He watched his mother's face, waiting for her final breath. Just then, his neighbor, a man named Magnus, came to the door. Magnus was a Dane. His father had been one of the warriors who had settled this land 2 generations ago. He and Leofwine were friends. They farmed neighboring fields. They spoke a mixed language, a practical blend of Old English and Old Norse that was common throughout the Danelaw. Magnus looked at Elswith. He saw her chest rise and fall one last time, and then stop. He put a hand on Leofwine's shoulder. He said, in his direct northern way, Hundare, she dies. The Norse word was Deja. It was a stark, blunt word. It did not have the sense of a slow process. It meant to cease, to stop living. It was the endpoint, the final event. To the Norse, life was a struggle, and death was its abrupt conclusion. Their language reflected that. Leofwine heard the word Deja. It sounded so different from his own word, Styrfon. Styrfon was the long, cold journey into darkness. Deja was the moment the door slammed shut. In that moment, with his mother's hand still warm in his, the Norse word felt more true. Her long suffering was over. Her life had not faded, it had stopped. Over the next days, as the village prepared for the burial, Leofwine found himself thinking of the word. He heard it again when Magnus told another Norse settler what had happened. The word was common among the Danish families. It was a word for a hard reality. The two languages were living side by side. In the fields, in the market, in the homes, words were being exchanged and tested. Some Old English words survived. Some Norse words were adopted because they were more useful or more powerful or described something in a new way. Deja was one of those words. It was shorter and more direct than the Old English equivalents. As the years went by, it began to push out Styrfon and Swelton. The English people started to use it. The sound changed slightly, the oo sound disappearing, the vowel shifting. Deja became die and then die. The old word Styrfan did not vanish completely. It survived in a changed form as the word starve. But for the final act of ceasing to live, the blunt, uncompromising word from the Vikings became the standard. It was a word that looked death squarely in the face and called it what it was, an end. Number 13. What you call something depends on what it looks like on the inside. Aelfric the cook was having an argument. It was a small, silly argument, but it was causing a commotion in the kitchens of the Great Hall at Thetford. The year was 875, the Great Heathen Army had made the town its winter camp, and the kitchens were a chaotic mix of English servants and Norse warriors. The argument was about food. A Norse warrior named Bjarni had brought in a basket of eggs he had collected from the nests of wild seabirds on the coast. He handed them to Aelfric and told him to cook them. Aelfric, who only spoke a few words of Norse, pointed at them and said the Old English word for them, egru. Bjarni laughed. He shook his head and said, "Nay, egg." Aelfric was confused. He held one up. It was an egg. He had been cooking them his whole life. His word was agru. Why was this Northman calling them by a different name? He repeated his word, louder this time. Agru. Bjarni picked up one of the seabird eggs. It was large, with a hard, thick shell. He picked up one of the smaller, more fragile chicken eggs from Aelfric's own supply. He pointed at the chicken egg and said, "Agru." And then he pointed at the big seabird egg and said again, firmly, "Egg." Another warrior who spoke some English tried to explain. The Old English word agru, the plural of aeg, was the ancestor of the modern Southern English dialect word a, as in ear in eggs. But in the north of England, where Norse influence was strong, a different word was taking over. The Old Norse word was egg. The difference was not just in pronunciation, it was in what the words were related to. The Norse word egg was related to the word for edge ek in Old Norse. It described the object by its hard, sharp, well-defined shape. To Bjarni, the small, thin, shelled chicken eggs might be agru, but a proper, hard-shelled seabird egg was an egg, an edge. The English word aeg, on the other hand, came from an ancient Proto-Indo-European root word related to birds. It described the object by its origin. It was the thing that came from a bird. So the argument in the kitchen was a clash of two different ways of seeing the world. Was the object defined by its sharp, hard form, or by its origin from a bird? In the kitchens and markets of the Danelaw, the Norse word began to win. It was simpler to say. And as the Vikings settled and raised their own chickens, they called all of them egg. The hard sheep sound at the end was stronger and clearer than the soft sound of the Old English word. In the north of England, people stopped saying aegru and started saying eggs. The change was slow. For centuries, the two words existed side by side. In the south of England, people continued to say ear and well into the Middle Ages. The famous printer William Caxton, writing in 1490, told a story about a merchant from the north who came to a pub in London and asked for eggs. The landlady said she didn't speak French. Another customer had to explain that he meant Aaron. The story shows that even 600 years after Bjarni and Aelfric argued in the kitchen, the two words were still in use. But eventually, the clear, simple, hard-edged word from the Vikings, egg, became the standard word all across England. Number 12. You don't need a sword to cut your bread, but you do need something sharp. It was the year 910, in the market of the fortified town of Leicester. A trader named Sigtryg had laid out his wares on a wooden stall. He sold things that the local English farmers could not easily make themselves: iron cooking pots, whetstones from Norway, and his most popular item, knives. An English woman named Elswith approached his stall. She needed a new knife for her kitchen. Her old one had a broken tip. She looked at the knives Sigtryg had for sale. They were simple, practical tools. They had a single-edged iron blade, about 4 or 5 inches long, with a straight back. The handle was made of wood or bone. Elswith picked one up. It felt solid and well-balanced. In her own language, she had a word for a blade. It was seeks. But a seeks was usually a larger weapon, a kind of short sword or dagger that every free man carried. It was a tool of war and hunting as much as a daily utensil. The thing she held in her hand was different. It was smaller, designed for cutting food, mending leather, or carving wood. It was a personal, domestic tool. Sigtryg saw her examining the knife. He said the name of the object in his own tongue. Knife! He made a motion of cutting a loaf of bread. Or nefer, he repeated. Elswith liked the word. It was short and sharp, like the blade itself. It sounded different from seeks. It seemed to fit this specific kind of tool perfectly. She paid Sigtryg a small silver coin for the knife and took it home. That evening in her hut, her son asked her what she had bought at the market. She showed him the new tool. She used the word the trader had used. Niffer, she said, trying to copy his pronunciation. The scene was repeated in markets all across the Danelaw. The Norse settlers brought with them not just their language, but their material culture. Their knifer was a specific and incredibly useful tool, one that everyone needed. The English had their seeks, but the knifer filled a different niche, and as the English people bought and used the tool, they started to use its Norse name. The word was simple to say and easy to remember. It had a hard practical sound. Over the following century, the word knifer was absorbed into the English language. The cuss sound at the beginning, which had been silent in some Old English words, was pronounced in this new word. The sound of the word changed slightly, becoming knife. The old word seeks did not disappear entirely. It survived in the name of the English people themselves, the Saxons or sword men, and in the name of the county of Essex East Saxons. But for the everyday tool used for cutting, the Norse word took over completely. It was a case of a better tool and a more specific word arriving at the same time. To number 11, a person's worth is not in what they have, but in what they can do. Catiel was a boat builder's apprentice in the town of Lincoln. The year was 965. He was not a strong boy, and he could not lift the heaviest timbers, but he had a talent. He could look at a piece of wood and see the boat inside it. He understood the curves and the lines. He knew how to make a joint fit so perfectly that it needed no iron nails. His master, an old Norseman named Skapti, recognized the boy's ability. One day, a wealthy merchant came to Skapti's workshop. He wanted a new river barge built, a strong one to carry wool down to the coast. He looked at the boys working in the yard. He pointed to Catiel. "He is small," the merchant said to Skapti. "Is he any good?" Skapti did not talk about the boy's strength or his family. He used a single Norse word. He has skill. Skill was a very important concept in the Norse world. It did not just mean the ability to do something. It meant discernment, knowledge, the ability to tell one thing from another, to make a distinction. A man with skill in woodworking could distinguish between good and bad timber. A man with skill in law could distinguish between a just and an unjust claim. It was about judgment and expertise, not just raw talent. The merchant understood. To say Ketil had skill was the highest praise. It meant he had the knowledge and the judgment to do the job correctly. The merchant nodded, satisfied. Ketil was put to work helping design the new barge. The English people living and working in Lincoln heard this word all the time. Their own word for a similar idea was craft. But craft was more about physical power and ability. A skill was about the mind, about knowledge. It was a useful distinction. They began to use the word themselves. They would talk about a weaver who had skill in choosing colors, or a farmer who had skill in knowing when to plant. The word passed into the evolving English language of the region. It kept its core meaning of expertise and discernment. Skill became skill. It became a word to describe the abilities that people learned and perfected, the things that made them valuable to their community. It was a word that celebrated knowledge over brute force, a quiet tribute to the Norse idea that the most important tool a person has is their judgment. Number 10. The part of you that faces the world is not the same as the hide of an animal. The hunter's name was Ulfar, and he was skinning a deer. It was a cold morning in the year 888 in the woods of the Peak District. His people had settled in this hilly country, raising sheep and hunting. He worked quickly with his knifer, his movements precise and economical. He had been doing this since he was a boy. An English boy from a nearby farming settlement was watching him. The boy's name was Sinewolf. He had never seen a man work so fast. Ulfar separated the deer's covering from the meat in one large piece. Sinewolf pointed at the bloody sheet of deer covering on the ground. "That is a good hide," he said in his own language. Ulfar paused. He understood the boy's word. Hid hide was what the English called the skin of a large animal, something that would be turned into thick leather for shields or shoes. He agreed it was a good hide, but then Ulfar did something that confused the boy. He pointed with his knife to the back of his own hand, to the pale flesh covered in hair. Skin, he said. Then he pointed to the fine, soft fur of a rabbit that he had also caught. Skin, he said again. To Ulfar and to all Norse speakers, there was a distinction. Hide was the thick, tough covering of a large animal like a cow or a deer. Skin was the covering of a person, or the finer, fur-bearing pelt of a smaller animal like a rabbit or a fox. It was a more delicate, more personal word. You wouldn't say you had a hide on your body. You had skin. Sinewolf began to understand. There was a difference. The tough, hairy covering of the deer was one thing. The covering on his own arm was another. The Norse word provided a useful way to separate the two ideas. This distinction was adopted into English. As Norse and English people lived together, they found the two words useful. Hide became hide, and it kept its meaning of the thick skin of a large animal. The Norse word skin was also adopted, becoming skin. It came to mean the outer layer of a person, an animal, or even a fruit. The Old English word for a person's skin, fell out of common use, surviving only in words like fellmonger, a dealer in hides. The Vikings gave English a new way to talk about the very surface of the world, a word that separated the personal and delicate from the tough and industrial. It was a subtle change, but a profound one. Number 9. What is unpleasant to look at is also something you should be afraid of. The warrior's name was Orm. He was not a handsome man. His face was scarred from a dozen battles. One of his eyes was milky and blind. His nose had been broken and badly set. But it was not his appearance alone that made men fear him. It was his reputation. He was known for his ferocity in battle. He fought with a cold, silent rage. When Jarl Ivar's army marched into the town of Reading in 871, the sight of Orm at the head of the warband was enough to make the local militia lose heart. An English farmer, huddled with his family in a cellar, saw Orm pass by in the street. He did not have a word for what he felt. A fool or evil did not seem right. Orm was not just unpleasant to look at, he was terrifying. His appearance was a promise of violence. Later, he heard two of the Norse warriors talking. They were speaking about Orm. One of them used a word to describe him. The word was ugliger. Ugliger came from the Old Norse word ugler, which meant fear or dread. So ugliger did not mean physically unattractive. It meant dreadful or to be feared. When a Viking called a warrior ugliger, it was a compliment. It meant he had a fearsome reputation. The English farmer heard the word and connected it to the terrifying man he had seen. The meaning was clear. Ugliger was the perfect word for Orm. It combined the idea of a fearsome appearance with the feeling of dread it produced. The word began to seep into the local dialect. The English people started to use it to describe things that were not just unattractive, but also intimidating or menacing. A dark, threatening sky could be described as ugliger. A gnarled, spooky-looking tree in the forest could be ugliger. Over the centuries, the sound of the word changed. The hard Norse sounds softened, the ending fell away. Ugliger became ugly, and as the word evolved, its meaning shifted. The original sense of fearful or dreadful began to fade. The modern meaning, unpleasant to look at, became dominant, but the word's history is still there, just beneath the surface, deep down. The word ugly doesn't just mean something is misshapen, it carries an ancient echo of fear, a reminder that the Vikings often saw a terrifying appearance as a sign of a dangerous spirit. Number 8. A hard blow is a universal language. The fight started over a game of dice. It was a common enough event in the rowdy camps of the Great Heathen Army, wintering near Repton in 874. Two warriors, a Norwegian named Koli and a Dane named Svein, were arguing over a debt. Words turned to shoves. Shoves turned to blows. Koli was faster. He struck Svein hard on the side of the head with his fist. Svein staggered back, a look of surprise on his face. The other men watching shouted. One of them yelled the Old Norse word for the action, hida. Hide was a simple onomatopoeic word. It meant to strike or to come upon by chance. It was the word for a successful blow, whether with a fist, a sword, or an arrow finding its mark. It was also the word for chancing upon something, like finding a good harbor. It was a word of impact and discovery. An English boy who served ale to the warriors watched the fight. He knew the word. He heard it all the time. The Vikings used it for everything. They would hit a nail with a hammer. They would hope to hit a good fortune on a raid. And, they would hit each other in a brawl. His own Old English word for striking something was sleen, which would become slay or drepan. These were strong words, but hitta was different. It was short, sharp, and forceful. It sounded like the action it described. The word was too useful to ignore. It was adopted quickly and easily by the English-speaking population in the Danelaw. It was a verb of action, a word for a world where physical impact was a daily reality. The form of the word barely changed as it entered English. Hitta became hit. It kept both of its original meanings for a time. You could hit a person, and you could also hit upon an idea, which preserves the older Norse sense of finding something by chance. It's one of the most basic and common verbs of action in modern English. Its journey into the language was not complicated. It was a direct, forceful word for a direct, forceful action, and it punched its way into the vocabulary with little resistance. Number 7. Sometimes the best way to say something is also the shortest. Gisli was a trader from Trondheim. His business was bringing Norwegian whetstones and soapstone pots to the markets of Jorvik. The year was 935. Jorvik was a thriving city, a crossroads of cultures and languages. To do business, Gisli had to speak a functional mix of Old Norse and Old English. He was good at it, but he sometimes grew impatient with the English way of saying things. One afternoon, he was finalizing a deal with an English merchant named Ordric for a large shipment of whetstones. So they agreed on a price. Ordric, wanting to confirm the deal, used a common Old English phrase. Fawn to, he said, which literally meant to take to or to receive. Gisli understood him, but the phrase felt clumsy and long-winded to his ears. In his own language, he had a single, powerful word for the same concept. Geta. It meant to obtain, to acquire, to receive, to succeed in doing something. It was a versatile, all-purpose verb. He nodded to Ordric, and to show he understood and agreed, he used his own word. Geta, he said, tapping the contract. I get the silver, you get the stones. Ordric heard the word. He had heard it before from the Norse traders. Geta. It was so much simpler than fawn to, one short, sharp syllable to cover a wide range of meanings. It was efficient. In a busy multilingual marketplace, efficiency was valuable. The word geta was like a perfect tool, and it was easy to use and could do many jobs. You could get goods in a market. You could get an illness. You could get to a destination. You could get someone to do something. Its sheer usefulness was undeniable. The English people of the Danelaw, who were in daily contact with Norse speakers, quickly realized the power of this little word. They started to use it. It was just easier. It began to replace a whole range of more cumbersome Old English verbs. Like the word geta entered English with very little change. The vowel sound shifted slightly, and it became get. Its incredible versatility, a hallmark of its Norse origin, has made it one of the most frequently used verbs in the English language. From a simple trader's word used in a Jorvik market, it grew to become an indispensable part of the vocabulary, a testament to the Viking preference for words that were practical, direct, and multi-purpose. Number 6. The sky is not a single thing. It is a mass of moving clouds. It was the year 895. Young Alara was an English girl living in a small farming village in the Yorkshire Wolds. Her village had been living peacefully with the Norse settlers in the next valley for a generation. They traded goods, their children played together, and their languages were slowly starting to merge. One summer afternoon, Alara was playing in a field with her friend, a Norse girl named Runa. A storm was approaching from the west. The heavens grew dark. Alara looked up at the churning gray mass above them. In her language, Old English, she would call the expanse above her Heophon heaven. She might call the airlift, but she didn't have a single common word for the clouds themselves or the visible dome above. Runa pointed upwards. Sky, she said, her voice filled with a little bit of awe and fear. Sky is angry today. Sky was the Old Norse word for cloud. It came from an older Germanic word meaning shadow or covering. To the Norse, who lived their lives under dramatic, fast-moving northern weather, the clouds were the most important feature of the heavens. They were not just things in the sky, they were the sky itself. They used the word sky to mean both cloud and, in the plural, the entire visible expanse above. Alara had heard the word before, but today, with the storm coming, it clicked. Sky. It was a good word. It captured the feeling of the great moving, shadowy mass that was about to unleash rain and wind. It felt more alive and more immediate than her word Hieophon, which felt distant and spiritual. She said the word herself. Sky. It felt right. The word was too useful to be confined to the Norse settlements. All across the north of England, where the weather was a constant topic of conversation and concern, the English people started to use sky. It was the perfect word for the often overcast dome above them. The word displaced the Old English Wolson, which survives today only in the poetic word Wilkin. Sky entered the language, its pronunciation changing slightly to become sky. It became the default word for the atmosphere above us, a permanent linguistic reminder of the cloudy, dramatic heavens that the Viking settlers knew so well. Every time we look up and talk about a blue or a gray sky, we are using a word that originally just meant cloud. Number 5, happiness is not a state of mind, it is a matter of luck. The voyage had been good. Einar's ship had returned to the settlement on the Wirral Peninsula in the spring of 903. They had sailed to Dublin and traded English wool for Irish silver and slaves. The journey had been dangerous, but the weather had been fair and the profits were high. And they had been lucky. As they unloaded their cargo, Einar's wife Gudrun came to meet him. She saw the relief and success on his face. She smiled. "You have good hap," she said. Hap was an Old Norse word that meant chance or good fortune. It was a word about external circumstances, not internal feelings. To have good hap meant that events had turned out in your favor. The gods, or fate, had been kind to you. An Englishman named Oswald, who worked on the docks helping to unload the ships, heard the word. He was used to the Norse sailors and their talk. He knew that hap was a word they used all the time. If a fishing trip was successful, it was good hap. If a child recovered from a sickness, it was good hap. The English had words for joy, bliss, and gladness glade. These words described an internal emotional state. But they didn't have a common, everyday word for simple good luck, for the happy chance of things working out well. The Norse word filled that gap. Oswald and other English speakers started to use the word. At first, they used it in the Norse way to talk about chance and fortune. They might say that finding a lost coin was a happy chance. Over time, the meaning of the word began to shift. If good fortune makes you feel good, then it was a short step to using the adjective form happy to describe the feeling itself. Well, the word began to turn inward. It started to describe not just the lucky event, but the emotional result of that event. By the late Middle Ages, happy had become the primary English word for the feeling of joy and contentment. But its origins are still visible in other words. The word happen means for something to occur by chance. The word hapless means to be unlucky. And the phrase happy-go-lucky still captures that original Norse sense of someone who cheerfully trusts to chance. The very idea of happiness in English is rooted in a Viking word for luck. Number 4. Some words are for actions too terrible for polite conversation. The monastery at Bardney in Lincolnshire had been one of the great centers of learning in the Anglo-Saxon world. But that was before. The year was 870. The great heathen army had swept through the kingdom. The monastery was now a ruin of burned timbers and fallen stones. A few months later, a small group of monks returned. They walked through the wreckage of their home. Their brother Gregory, an old man who had survived by hiding in the fens, looked at the scene of devastation. The library, with its priceless manuscripts, was a pile of ash. The church had been stripped of its gold and silver. And in the main yard he saw the bones of his brothers left unburied. He searched for a word to describe what had happened. Murdrian to murder was not quite right. That was for the killing of one person by another. This was something else. This was a wholesale, brutal killing. He heard the word from the local villagers who had witnessed the attack. They had a new word, a Norse word, to describe what the army had done. They called it a slatra. In Old Norse, slatra meant to butcher animals for meat. It was a farming word, a word for the cold, methodical work of killing and cutting up livestock. The villagers had watched the Viking army kill the monks with the same brutal efficiency that a butcher would use on a cow or a sheep. And so they used the butcher's word for it. Brother Gregory shuddered. The word was ugly and raw. It was not a word for a history book, it was a word from the farm and the abattoir, but it was the right word. It captured the inhumanity of the act. The killers had not treated their victims as men, but as animals. The word born of horror began to spread. It was a word for a new kind of violence that the English had not previously had a common term for. As the Vikings settled, the word slatra entered the vocabulary of the Danelaw. Its form changed over time. The te sound was added, and it became slaughter. The meaning broadened from butchering animals to include the large-scale, brutal killing of people. It remains one of the most brutal and direct words in the English language, a linguistic scar left by the violence of the Viking Age. Number 3, a special treat is often a simple thing. In the Norse world, festivals were important. Yule, at midwinter, was a time to feast and celebrate the hope of the sun's return. In a small Norse settlement near Derby, in the year 920, a woman named Inga was preparing for the Yule feast. She was making a special treat for her family. She took flour, honey, and eggs and mixed them into a stiff dough. She shaped the dough into small, round, flat discs. Then she cooked them on a hot, flat stone over the fire. In her language, she called these treats kaka. Her English neighbor, a woman named Wulfwin, came to visit. She watched Inga cooking. The English baked bread, of course, but these small, sweet, flattened things were different. They were not quite bread, they were something special. Inga offered one to Wulfwin. It was warm and sweet with honey. Wulfwin had never tasted anything quite like it. "What is this called?" she asked. "Kaka," Inga replied. The word was simple, with a repeated sound like a child's word. It was easy to say and remember. Wulfwin went home and tried to make her own kaka for her children. They loved them. The word and the recipe spread. In the towns and villages of the Danelaw, where English and Norse families lived side by side, the word kaka became the common term for any small, flattened, baked, sweet bread. It was a word of the home, of the kitchen, of treats and celebrations. As English evolved, the pronunciation of kaka shifted. The vowels changed and it became the modern word cake. For a long time, a cake was still understood to be a small, hard, round thing, more like a modern biscuit or cookie. It was only much later, with the arrival of new baking technologies and ingredients like sugar, that the word came to describe the large, soft, spongy dessert we think of today. But the name itself is a direct descendant of the simple, honey-sweetened flatbreads that a Viking woman cooked on a stone for a midwinter festival. Number 2, the support you walk on is not a limb. The accident happened during the construction of the town wall at Stamford in 918. A heavy timber slipped and fell, crushing a man's leg. The man was an Anglo-Saxon laborer named Godric. The foreman of the construction crew was a Dane named Halfdan. Halfdan rushed over to help. He saw Godric's injury. In Godric's own language, Old English, he would have described the injured part of his body as his skanka shank or his fought foot. The word limb existed, but it was a general term for any appendage. Halfdan, however, used a different word. He pointed to Godric's shattered limb and shouted for help, using the Old Norse word legger. In Old Norse, legger specifically meant one of the long bones of the arm or leg, and by extension, the entire limb used for standing and walking. It was related to a word meaning to lay, as a leg is what you lay down when you lie down. It was a simple anatomical word. The other English workers heard the word. They understood from Halfdan's tone and gesture what it meant. In the chaos of the moment, the short, clear Norse word cut through. The word legger was practical. The English word skanka only referred to the lower part of the leg, from the knee to the ankle it survives as shank. There was no simple, everyday English word for the entire limb from the hip to the foot. The Norse word filled this vocabulary gap perfectly. As English and Norse people worked together, building towns, farming fields, and sailing ships, the word legger was adopted. It was more specific and more useful than any of the English alternatives. The hard sound at the end softened, and legger became leg. The old word skanka was pushed aside, surviving only in its more limited meaning. The Vikings, a people who lived a hard, physical life, gave the English language a new and better word to describe one of the most important parts of the human body. Number 1. Some feelings are just freckles on your soul. Kari was a young Norse boy who lived in the Orkney Islands, a place where the Norse had ruled for 100 years. It was the year 970. Kari had red hair and a face covered in small, brown spots. His mother, laughing, would touch his face and call them by their Norse name Freknur. The word came from the Old Norse freknodr, which meant freckled. It was a common, affectionate term. Later in his life, Kari became a trader. He sailed to the north of England, to the markets in places like Durham and York. There, he did business with the local people who spoke a dialect of English that was heavily influenced by a century of Norse settlement. One day, he was talking with an English merchant. The merchant was complaining about some small, irritating problems with a shipment. He described them as little worries, like spots on a clean cloth. Kari, searching for the right word in his mixed vocabulary, used the word from his childhood. He said, yes, they are like Freknur. He used the word for his freckles to describe small, scattered, unimportant blemishes. The English merchant, who might have had freckled children of his own, understood the metaphor perfectly. He liked the word Freknur. It had a nice, slightly comical sound to it. It was a good word for a small, insignificant blemish. The word caught on. It was a descriptive and unusual term. It began to be used not just for spots on the skin, but for any small flaw or mark. The form of the word changed as it settled into English. Freknur became freckle. It is one of the more surprising and specific words to have come from the Vikings. It's not a word about war or law or farming. It's a personal, descriptive word, a word for a small and common human feature. It's a reminder that the Vikings were not just raiders and warriors. They were also farmers, traders, and parents who had affectionate, everyday words for the spots on their children's faces.